For more than 90% of human existence, there are no diaries, no confessions, no myths written in a familiar hand. Stone tools remain, fire pits remain, bones arranged with care remain. But the inner voice of the people who made them does not. This absence is not small. It stretches across hundreds of thousands of years, leaving behind a version of humanity described almost entirely by others, much later, looking back through fragments. What kind of life can be reconstructed when the people themselves never had the chance to speak for it? The consequences of this silence are subtle but far-reaching. Without words, intention becomes guesswork. Without testimony, daily life collapses into stereotype. The average caveman becomes an image rather than a person, a blunt figure moving between hunger and cold, stripped of nuance, routine, and thought. And yet the ground tells a more complicated story. Archaeologists uncover campsites reused over generations, suggesting memory of place. They find tools repaired rather than discarded, hinting at planning beyond the moment. Hearths appear arranged to manage heat and smoke. Food remains show seasonal awareness, patience, and restraint. None of this belongs to a creature living only on instinct. Still, the language used to describe these people often flattens them, as if complexity only begins with agriculture, cities, or writing. The idea of progress depends on contrast. To define civilization as advanced, something before it must appear crude. In this way, the caveman becomes useful. He stands at the beginning of the story, carrying the weight of ignorance so that everything after can seem brighter. But this framing raises a quiet discomfort. If early humans survived ice ages, migrated across continents, adapted to wildly different ecosystems, and passed knowledge across generations without writing, what kind of intelligence does that require? Life for the average Paleolithic human was not a single experience. It changed with climate, geography, and time. A group living in Ice Age Europe faced different rhythms than one near African lakes or Asian coastlines. Yet across these differences, certain patterns repeat. Small bands, deep familiarity with landscapes, and intimacy with animals, plants, weather, and sound that modern humans rarely experience. Survival depended not on domination, but on attention. Daily life likely moved at a different pace. Hours were not divided by clocks, but by light, hunger, temperature, and social need. Work and rest were not separated cleanly. Tool-making, childcare, storytelling, and food preparation overlapped. Knowledge was embodied. You learned by watching hands, listening to breath, noticing mistakes. Memory lived in movement and repetition, not in abstraction. There is also evidence of care that unsettles the brutal image. Skeletons show individuals who lived years with injuries or disabilities that would have prevented independent survival. Someone fed them. Someone protected them. This suggests social bonds strong enough to absorb vulnerability. It suggests that compassion is not a late invention. Still, much remains unreachable. We do not know what an average day felt like from the inside. We do not know how fear sounded at night, or how boredom passed, or how loss was explained. We do not know what children were told about the world beyond the horizon. These absences invite interpretation, but they also invite caution, Because when a history has no voice, it is easy to replace it with assumptions, and assumptions, repeated long enough, begin to feel like facts. Perhaps the question is not only how cavemen lived, but why their lives are so often simplified, even when the evidence resists it. What does that simplification allow us to believe about ourselves now? What survives from the Paleolithic world arrives without explanation. A cut mark on bone, a ring of stones darkened by fire, a handprint pressed into cave wall pigment, fingers splayed as if counting or reaching. These fragments sit quietly in museums and reports, stripped of sound and temperature, detached from the living rhythm that once gave them meaning. And from this silence, a question grows heavier. What did an ordinary day actually require of a human being who lived entirely inside nature, not beside it? For the average caveman, survival was not an emergency but a condition. Hunger was expected, not panicked. Cold was planned for, not feared as catastrophe. Life unfolded within narrow margins, yet those margins were understood deeply. Knowledge of animal paths, edible roots, shifting seasons, and distant water sources was not specialized expertise. It was shared memory, held collectively and reinforced through repetition. Forgetting carried consequences. Remembering kept the group alive. Archaeological layers show patterns that resist randomness. Campsites appear positioned to catch wind without exposure. Food remains indicate deliberate selection, not constant desperation. Bones of large animals are often processed with efficiency, suggesting coordinated effort rather than chaotic struggle. These details hint at routines. And routine implies predictability. Predictability allows something rare to emerge, moments of mental space. If survival tasks consumed every waking hour, cave art would not exist. Yet it does. Paintings layered over centuries show animals in motion, abstract signs, careful use of cave contours. These were not hurried marks. They required preparation, pigments, light sources, and time spent deep underground where no practical advantage waited. The average caveman did not decorate living spaces out of boredom alone. Something compelled this effort. Some researchers suggest ritual. Others suggest teaching tools, memory aids, or symbolic mapping of animal behavior. None of these explanations exclude daily life. In fact, they depend on it. A mind overwhelmed by constant crisis does not invent symbols. It reacts. The presence of symbolism suggests that Paleolithic humans lived close enough to the edge to respect it, but not so close that imagination disappeared. Social life likely filled much of the day. Small groups meant repeated interaction with the same individuals across years. Conflicts could not be avoided by distance. Cooperation was not optional. Reputation mattered. Skill mattered. Emotional intelligence mattered. A person who disrupted group balance risked isolation, which in a Paleolithic world could be fatal. This pressure favored restraint, empathy, and awareness long before formal ethics existed. Children learned early, not through instruction but immersion. Tools scaled down in size suggest practice objects. Play merged with learning. There was no clear boundary between education and life. Observation replaced explanation. Correction happened through example, not lecture. In such a system, knowledge remained flexible, adaptable, and deeply contextual. The absence of hierarchy is often assumed, but evidence suggests something more nuanced. While no palaces existed, social differentiation likely did. Elders carried memory, skilled hunters carried influence, healers, shamans, or ritual specialists may have occupied ambiguous positions, respected yet not fully separate. Authority flowed from usefulness and trust rather than force. It could shift. It could be challenged. Sleep patterns also differed. Without artificial light, nights were longer, broken by fire tending, storytelling, quiet vigilance. Darkness was not absolute, but familiar. Sounds carried meaning. Silence carried warning. Dreams may have held weight, blending seamlessly with waking interpretations of the world. In such an environment, imagination was not escapism, it was orientation. What modern narratives often miss is that the average caveman did not experience life as primitive. There was no reference point for comparison. The world simply was. Forests, plains, ice, animals, weather, and stars formed a complete reality. Within that reality, humans adapted, negotiated, and belonged. The danger lies in assuming that complexity requires technology. Paleolithic life suggests another form of complexity, one rooted in perception, memory, and relationship. A complexity that leaves fewer durable traces and therefore invites erasure. If so much of early human life depended on things that do not fossilize, voice, gesture, routine, trust, then what we call missing history may not be missing at all. It may simply exist in forms we no longer know how to read. And if the average caveman lived within a system of knowledge that functioned without writing, measurement, or abstraction, what does that say about the kinds of intelligence we have learned to value and the ones we have learned to overlook? Time, for the Paleolithic human, did not move in straight lines. It folded back on itself, returned, repeated. Days were measured not by numbers, but by patterns. The angle of light at a certain rock face, the sound of insects at dusk, the migration of animals across familiar routes. This cyclical sense of time shaped not only behavior, but expectation. Tomorrow was not an unknown frontier. It was a variation of something already lived. This perception alters how uncertainty is carried. When life is organized around recurrence, fear loses some of its sharpness. Death is present but not abstract. It appears in the form of animal kills, seasonal losses, and aging bodies. Burial practices, modest as they often were, suggest attention rather than avoidance. Bodies positioned carefully, objects placed nearby, pigments used. These gestures do not explain death, but they acknowledge it. The average caveman likely lived with a constant awareness of mortality, yet without the narrative of catastrophe that modern minds attach to it. There were no written prophecies, no fixed doctrines of afterlife. Meaning emerged from continuity rather than promise. You lived as others had lived. You would die as others had died. Memory lived on in those who remained, not in monuments. Fire sat at the center of this world. It was not merely a tool, but a presence. Fire extended the day, transformed food, repelled danger, and gathered people together. Around it, stories may have formed. Not myths in the later sense, but shared recollections, warnings, observations. Language evolved in this space, shaped by repetition and rhythm. Words carried weight because there were fewer of them. Sound mattered deeply. Without constant noise, subtle changes became meaningful. The shift in wind, the crack of ice, the distant movement of animals. Listening was survival. Silence was not emptiness but information. This auditory world trained attention in ways difficult to recover in modern settings. The landscape itself functioned as memory. Paths worn by generations guided movement. Certain trees, rocks, and water sources became reference points. Knowledge was spatial. To know something was to know where it lived. This meant that memory could not be separated from place. When groups migrated, they carried stories that mapped new environments onto familiar patterns. This intimate connection to land complicates modern assumptions about ownership. There is little evidence of territorial domination in the Paleolithic sense. Boundaries likely existed, but they were negotiated through movement, kinship, and shared resources rather than fixed borders. Conflict occurred, but not as organized warfare. Violence, when it happened, was personal and immediate, not institutional. Food gathering occupied much of daily life, yet it was not mindless labor. Foraging required constant decision-making. What to take, what to leave, what to return to later. Overharvesting threatened future survival. Restraint was not moralized, it was practical. The environment responded quickly to imbalance. Gender roles, often oversimplified, likely varied widely. Skeletal evidence and tool distribution suggest flexibility rather than rigid division. Strength mattered, but so did knowledge, endurance, and coordination. Survival favored contribution over conformity. Tasks could shift with need. There is also growing evidence that Paleolithic humans engaged in long-distance exchange. Materials found far from their source suggest travel or trade networks extending beyond immediate territory. This implies social connections across groups, shared symbols, and negotiated relationships. The average caveman was not isolated in a tiny world. He or she lived within a web of known and unknown others. What is striking is how little of this requires formal authority. Order emerged organically, maintained by shared dependence and constant feedback from the environment. Mistakes were visible. Successes were remembered. This system punished excess and rewarded attention. Modern life often frames early humans as living in constant fear, but fear, when constant, becomes background. What may have been more dominant is awareness. Awareness of weather, awareness of animals, awareness of each other, awareness of small changes that signaled larger shifts. This awareness shaped thought itself. Without abstraction, thinking remained grounded. Ideas were not detached from experience. They arose from it. This may explain why symbolic expression appears alongside practical mastery. The same mind that tracked herds also imagined them in pigment and line. If daily life in the Paleolithic required such finely tuned perception, then the loss of that mode of living may represent not an advance, but a trade. Something gained in stability, something lost in intimacy. And if so much of human cognitive capacity evolved within this older rhythm of time, what happens when that rhythm disappears? What parts of ourselves quieted along with it, unnoticed, as the world began to move faster than memory could follow? If daily life followed a rhythm shaped by land and season, belief followed quietly alongside it, woven into action rather than separated from it. For the average caveman, there was no clear boundary between the practical and the meaningful. A successful hunt, a sudden storm, an illness that lingered longer than expected. Each event carried weight beyond its immediate outcome, not as doctrine, but as pattern. There is no evidence of temples in the Paleolithic world, yet certain places were returned to again and again. Caves deep enough to erase daylight. Rock shelters marked with repeated signs. Open areas aligned with the movement of the sun or stars. These were not chosen at random. The effort required to reach them suggests intention, and intention implies belief, even if its shape remains unclear. Cave art offers the strongest hint. Animals dominate the walls, but not as static trophies. They move, they overlap. Some appear wounded, others exaggerated. Human figures are rare, often abstract, sometimes hybrid. This imbalance unsettles modern expectations. If Paleolithic people were primarily concerned with survival, why depict animals with such care and humans with such restraint? One possibility is humility. Another is identification. Animals were not merely prey. They were co-inhabitants of the world, powerful, unpredictable, and worthy of attention. Some researchers propose that these images relate to hunting magic, attempts to influence success. Others see them as expressions of cosmology, early efforts to map relationships between humans, animals, and unseen forces. Still others suggest teaching tools, mnemonic devices, or rites of passage. None of these explanations exclude daily life. They sit beside it, extending it into symbolic space. Ritual in this context was not performance. It was repetition, lighting a fire in a certain way, marking time with pigments, returning to the same place to renew signs. These actions created continuity. They linked generations without words. They allowed memory to persist when individuals did not. Burial practices deepen this picture. Graves containing ochre, tools, or ornaments suggest care beyond disposal. These gestures required effort from people already living close to necessity. That effort implies meaning strong enough to justify cost. Death was not ignored. It was integrated. There is debate about the role of shamans or ritual specialists. Some skeletal remains show unusual treatment. Some art depicts figures that appear transformed. These may indicate individuals who mediated between visible and invisible worlds. If so, their role likely emerged from communal need rather than imposed authority. In small groups, specialization must be earned repeatedly. What matters is not whether Paleolithic belief resembles later religion, but that it existed at all. The average caveman did not move through a neutral world. The environment responded. Animals behaved with intention. Weather carried moods. This does not imply superstition in the modern sense, but relationship. A way of being that recognized agency beyond the self. This worldview shaped behavior subtly. Waste was dangerous. Disrespect carried risk. Success demanded alignment rather than control. Such attitudes are difficult to recover archaeologically, yet they leave traces in restraint, repetition, and care. As populations grew and environments changed, these belief systems would have adapted, but their roots lie in the Paleolithic, formed over tens of thousands of years. They are not inventions of crisis. They are responses to long-term intimacy with a world that could not be dominated. Modern narratives often strip early belief of sophistication, reducing it to fear or ignorance. Yet fear alone does not produce symbolic consistency across vast regions and time spans. Ignorance does not produce layered meaning. What we see instead is coherence without codification. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. If early humans developed functional systems of meaning without hierarchy, doctrine, or written law, then later religious structures may represent not the birth of belief, but its consolidation. Something fluid becoming fixed. Something lived becoming administered. For the average caveman, belief did not belong to institutions. It belonged to place, to action, to memory carried in bodies rather than books. Its authority came from repetition and survival, not from command. As societies later grew larger and more complex, such intimacy became harder to maintain. Belief required simplification, standardization, enforcement. But in the Paleolithic world, belief remained embedded in daily life, inseparable from it. If that is so, then the loss of this mode of belief may not simply be a loss of superstition replaced by reason. It may be a loss of a way of relating to the world that once balanced attention, humility, and meaning without needing explanation. And if early humans lived within a belief system that required no names and left no doctrines, how much of it vanished, not because it failed, but because later systems had no way to recognize it? The body of the average caveman was not merely a vessel for survival. It was a record of adaptation written in muscle, bone, and scar. Every movement mattered. Walking was not an act of transportation alone, but of sensing terrain, wind, and distance. The ground spoke through the soles of the feet. Balance, posture, and endurance were not trained separately. They emerged through constant use. Skeletal remains tell a story that words never did. Strong leg bones suggest long-distance movement. Shoulder joints reveal repetitive throwing motions. Teeth worn down in specific patterns indicate not only diet, but tool use, hands replaced by jaws when necessary. These bodies were shaped by necessity, but not brutality. Injuries healed. Fractures knit back together. Survival did not end with damage. It adjusted. Pain in such a life was not always an emergency. It was information, a warning to move differently, to rest, to rely on others. The absence of modern medicine did not mean the absence of care. Plants with medicinal properties were known and used. Evidence of herbal knowledge appears indirectly, through residues and repeated patterns of plant use. Healing was experiential, tested across generations. The body was also a medium of expression. Ornaments made of shells, teeth, and bone appear across Paleolithic sites, often worn in patterns suggesting identity or affiliation. These were not random decorations. They required collection, shaping, and intention. Wearing them altered movement, sound, and visibility. The body became a signal, communicating belonging without speech. Physical proximity defined social bonds. Without written contracts or laws, trust was built through repeated interaction. Touch mattered. Shared labor mattered. The body registered familiarity. An unfamiliar posture, a different gait, could signal an outsider before words were exchanged. Recognition was sensory before it was conceptual. The average caveman's relationship with the body likely differed from modern disconnection. There was no separation between mind and body as distinct categories. Thought emerged through action. Understanding was kinetic. Skills lived in muscle memory. Forgetting occurred when movement ceased. This embodiment extended to knowledge of animals. Tracking required reading subtle signs, broken twigs, compressed grass, altered bird calls. These observations were not abstract data points. They were felt patterns, recognized through long familiarity. The body learned before the mind named. Hunting, often portrayed as violent and crude, demanded restraint and coordination. Missed throws wasted energy. Poor planning risked injury. Success required patience, silence, and precise timing. These are not qualities of impulsivity. They reflect discipline shaped by environment. Dietary evidence complicates assumptions further. Stable isotope analysis shows varied diets adapted to local conditions. Meat was important, but so were plants, tubers, nuts, and fruits. Food processing techniques improved digestibility and nutrition. Cooking transformed energy intake, reducing the time needed to chew and digest. This freed time, not trapped it. Freed time does not automatically produce progress, but it creates space. Space for social interaction, space for play, space for creativity. Children's handprints in caves suggest presence during art making. This implies that creativity was not restricted to elites or specialists. It was woven into family life. Aging in the Paleolithic world carried different meaning. Elders held memory. Their value increased with time, not decreased. They remembered landscapes before climate shifts, animal behavior across decades, social ties between groups. Their bodies may have weakened, but their usefulness deepened. This challenges modern assumptions about quality of life. While life expectancy at birth was low due to infant mortality, those who survived childhood often lived into older age. Longevity, when achieved, mattered. It shaped group survival. The average caveman did not experience life as short and brutal by default. It was variable, fragile, and uncertain, but also filled with continuity. The body adapted to that continuity, finding strength not in excess but in balance. Modern representations often emphasize danger, but danger becomes background when constant. What stands out instead is competence. Competence in navigating complexity without external support systems. Competence built through immersion rather than instruction. If the Paleolithic body carried knowledge that modern bodies no longer practice, then part of early human intelligence may have been physical in ways we rarely acknowledge. Intelligence not stored in symbols but in posture, rhythm, and response. And if that intelligence fades when the body is no longer required to listen so closely to the world, what else fades with it? Unnoticed. As comfort replaces attention. Food in the Paleolithic world was not a product, but a relationship that unfolded slowly across landscapes and seasons. For the average caveman, eating began long before a meal. It began with watching. The movement of animals across valleys, the ripening of plants at different elevations, the subtle changes in soil moisture that signaled when roots would be sweetest or poisonous. Hunger sharpened attention, but patience preserved life. Foraging was not random wandering. It was informed by memory layered over time. Certain places yielded food reliably. Others required restraint, visited only after recovery. This knowledge was not written, yet it endured, carried in stories, gestures, and shared routines. To forget was dangerous. To overtake was destructive. The land responded quickly to imbalance, and those responses were noticed. Cooking transformed more than diet. Fire softened food, released nutrients, reduced illness. This allowed bodies to grow differently. Teeth shrank. Jaws changed. Energy once spent on digestion could be redirected. This shift did not produce immediate comfort, but it produced flexibility. Flexibility allowed adaptation, migration, and survival across harsh climates. Meals were social, sharing reduced risk. A successful hunt fed more than one body. Distribution mattered. Evidence suggests that meat was often shared widely within groups rather than hoarded. Hoarding would have created conflict in small bands where memory was long and escape limited. Generosity, in this context, was practical. It stabilized relationships. Children learned food knowledge early. Which berries stained the fingers harmlessly, which caused sickness, which animals could be approached safely. Taste became education. Smell became warning. This sensory learning created a deep trust in embodied knowledge. Instructions were unnecessary when consequences were immediate. Seasonal scarcity shaped expectations. Periods of abundance were balanced by lean months. Fat storage, food drying, and delayed consumption show planning beyond the immediate moment. The average caveman lived with uncertainty, but not with constant surprise. Cycles taught restraint. This contrasts sharply with modern assumptions of Paleolithic chaos. Chaos exists where patterns are unknown. In early human life, patterns were known intimately. Unpredictability came from extremes, not from daily existence. Water access structured movement. Camps formed near reliable sources. During droughts or freezes, migration followed remembered routes. These movements created networks of knowledge extending across generations. Paths were not merely physical, they were historical, layered with memory of previous journeys. Trade expanded this network. Materials like obsidian, shells, and pigments traveled far beyond their source. This implies contact between distant groups, negotiated exchanges, and shared values. Food likely played a role in these interactions. Feasting may have marked alliances, reinforcing trust across unfamiliar faces. The emotional experience of food deserves attention. Eating after hunger is relief, but also reassurance. It confirms that knowledge still works, that the world remains legible. Failure, when it happened, carried weight not only in the body, but in confidence. Doubt could ripple through a group if patterns failed repeatedly. Climate shifts tested this system. Ice ages advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose. Forests became plains, then forests again. The Paleolithic world was not stable, yet humans persisted. Their flexibility did not rely on stored surplus alone, but on willingness to move, to adjust, to reinterpret signs. This adaptability challenges linear narratives of progress. Agriculture, often portrayed as improvement, narrowed diets and increased labor. Skeletal evidence from early farming communities shows declines in health and height compared to foraging populations. Stability came at a cost. Food became predictable, but vulnerability increased. For the average caveman, unpredictability was balanced by choice. When resources dwindled, movement was an option. Once rooted, movement became loss. This shift would later redefine human life, but during the Paleolithic, mobility preserved resilience. The act of eating carried meaning beyond sustenance. Certain animals appear repeatedly in art and ritual contexts, suggesting symbolic importance. Consuming such animals may have carried layered significance, blending nourishment with identity or belief. These meanings are difficult to reconstruct, but their persistence hints at depth. Modern depictions often reduce early diet to crude necessity. Yet necessity, when lived over millennia, becomes culture. Recipes without measurements. Traditions without names. Knowledge tested by hunger and refined by survival. If food shaped social bonds, belief, and movement so profoundly, then daily life in the Paleolithic was organized around attentiveness rather than accumulation. Satisfaction was temporary. Awareness was constant. And if modern abundance has severed that relationship, replacing attention with availability, what quiet skills were lost along the way? What subtle forms of knowing faded when food no longer required listening to the land before it could be eaten? Movement defined the Paleolithic world as much as shelter ever did. The average caveman did not belong to a fixed point on the land. Instead, the land unfolded beneath their steps, season after season. Mobility was not restlessness, it was strategy. To stay too long in one place risked depletion, disease, and tension. To move was to reset balance, to allow landscapes to recover, to follow abundance rather than exhaust it. Paths were not improvised, they were remembered. Repeated journeys etched invisible maps into collective memory. Certain valleys offered protection from wind. Certain passes opened only during brief windows of the year. River crossings shifted with melt and rain. These details were not recorded externally, yet they persisted, carried through stories, gestures, and the simple act of walking the same routes as those before. This mobility shaped perception of space. Distance was not abstract. It was measured in fatigue, hunger, and daylight. A place was not defined by coordinates but by experience, where you slept last winter, where a child was born, where someone died. Geography was personal. Shelter reflected this impermanence. Structures were light, adaptable, and easily abandoned. Skin tents, brush huts, windbreaks. These were not failures of architecture but expressions of need. The environment provided walls when required, cliffs, caves, dense forest. Shelter was temporary because life was. Investment favored tools and relationships over buildings. Caves, however, complicate this picture. Their repeated use suggests something beyond convenience. Deep caves offered stability, darkness, and insulation. They also erased the outside world. Entering them required intention. Lighting them required preparation. What happened inside was separated from daily tasks. Caves preserved art and ritual because they slowed time. In their depths, seasonal change faded. The outside world became distant. This separation may have allowed reflection, storytelling, or transformation. The average caveman did not live in caves continuously, but caves held something that open camps did not. Migration also shaped social structure. Encounters with other groups were inevitable. These meetings could bring exchange, marriage, conflict, or avoidance. Genetic evidence suggests interbreeding between groups, including with other hominin species. Boundaries were porous, identity was flexible. This fluidity contradicts later notions of fixed identity. For Paleolithic humans, belonging was negotiated through kinship, shared experience, and mutual recognition. Outsiders could become insiders over time. Trust was built through proximity and contribution, not origin. Night travel was rare but not impossible. Fire extended visibility, but darkness remained dominant. The stars provided orientation. Familiar constellations marked direction and season. This celestial awareness was practical before it was symbolic. Losing your way carried consequences. Weather dictated movement. Storms could trap groups. Cold snaps could force retreat. These disruptions tested resilience. Planning involved not only resources, but timing. Leaving too early or too late could be fatal. Decision-making balanced risk and opportunity continuously. This constant negotiation fostered collective decision-making. No single individual could hold all knowledge. Discussion mattered. Observation mattered. Consensus mattered. Authority emerged through experience rather than command. A leader who repeatedly misjudged movement would lose influence quickly. Modern assumptions often portray early humans as nomadic by necessity, longing for settlement. But settlement itself introduces new vulnerabilities. Staying increases waste, disease, and conflict. Mobility disperses pressure. It offers escape from mistakes. The eventual shift toward permanent settlement would radically alter human psychology. Ownership, accumulation, and hierarchy would emerge. But during the Paleolithic, movement preserved equality. Excess could not be carried far. Status remained tied to contribution rather than possession. The emotional texture of movement deserves attention. Leaving a familiar place carried loss. Returning carried reassurance. Landscapes held memory. Movement did not erase attachment, it multiplied it. Home was not singular, it was layered. Children born during migration learned adaptability early. Familiarity was not tied to walls, but to people. This may have fostered resilience. Stability came from relationships rather than location. If the average caveman experienced life as a series of returns rather than departures, then movement was not displacement. It was continuity expressed through change. Modern life often equates stability with immobility. The Paleolithic world suggests another model. Stability through responsiveness. A system that bends rather than breaks. If such a model sustained humanity for tens of thousands of years, then the assumption that progress requires rooting may deserve reconsideration. What was gained by settling is clear. What was lost may be harder to name. And if movement once protected humans from their own excess, what happens when movement becomes impossible and the land can no longer be left behind? Sound carried meaning long before it carried words. In the Paleolithic world, the average caveman lived inside an acoustic landscape shaped by wind, water, animal movement, and the subtle echoes of terrain. Silence was never empty. It was filled with information. A snapped branch at night altered posture instantly. A change in birdsong shifted attention. Listening was not passive. It was constant, embodied vigilance. Language emerged within this field of sound, but it did not dominate it. Early speech was likely sparse, contextual, supported by gesture and shared experience. Words did not need to explain what everyone already knew. They pointed, they warned, they coordinated. Meaning lived between sounds as much as within them. This economy of speech shaped thought. Without long chains of abstraction, communication remained grounded. What mattered was immediate relevance. Over time, rhythms formed, repeated phrases, cadences suited to memory rather than complexity. Storytelling did not unfold as linear narrative but as shared recollection, woven into daily tasks and repeated until it settled into familiarity. Fire amplified this process. Flames crackled, casting light unevenly, turning faces into shifting silhouettes. In this environment, sound carried emotion more than detail. Tone mattered. Pace mattered. A pause could signal danger or reflection. The average caveman learned to read these cues early, long before literacy separated sound from meaning. Music, if it existed, likely emerged from this space. Flutes carved from bone appear in the archaeological record, their holes spaced deliberately. These instruments required planning and sensitivity to pitch. Music does not aid survival directly. It does not feed or shelter. Yet it persists. This persistence suggests function beyond utility. Some researchers propose that music strengthened social bonds. Others suggest it aided ritual, marking transitions, or reinforcing shared identity. It may have regulated emotion, synchronized movement, or facilitated trance-like states during ritual or healing. Whatever its purpose, it reflects a capacity for abstraction rooted in sensation. Sound also shaped spatial awareness. Echoes in caves revealed depth and shape. Certain chambers amplified voices, others swallowed them. This acoustic variation may have influenced where art was placed. Some painted figures appear in areas where sound behaves unusually, hinting at deliberate choice. If so, Paleolithic humans were sensitive to invisible properties of space, not only visible ones. This sensitivity complicates assumptions about early cognition. To notice sound as structure requires attention beyond surface perception. It suggests curiosity about patterns that cannot be touched. Curiosity without language leaves faint traces, but those traces matter. Language eventually grew more complex, but for most of the Paleolithic, it remained embedded in action. Words did not describe reality from a distance. They participated in it. Naming an animal did not separate it from experience. It summoned memory of movement, behavior, risk. This closeness between word and world limited abstraction, but it deepened understanding. Misuse of language carried immediate consequences. A wrong warning could cost a life. Precision mattered, but precision of timing and tone rather than definition. As groups interacted, dialects may have formed. Subtle differences in sound, rhythm, or emphasis marked identity. These differences did not require translation. They were felt. Recognition preceded comprehension. Over time, as populations grew and interactions expanded, the burden on language increased. More coordination required more explanation. More explanation required more structure. This gradual shift would later culminate in grammar, symbols, and writing. But during the Paleolithic, language remained light, flexible, and deeply social. Modern humans often imagine early language as crude, limited by lack of vocabulary. But limitation can sharpen use. When words are few, each carries weight. Silence becomes expressive. Gesture becomes language. Understanding relies on shared context rather than explanation. This raises a subtle possibility. As language expanded and abstraction grew, something may have thinned. Sound became text. Voice became record. Memory moved outside the body. Communication gained reach but lost intimacy. In the Paleolithic world, forgetting a story required collective neglect. In the modern world, forgetting can happen despite preservation. Text survives without understanding. Sound survives without context. The average caveman lived inside a world where meaning was reinforced daily through repetition, sound, and presence. Nothing was stored externally. Everything depended on attention. If early humans cultivated such sensitivity to sound and silence, then the modern saturation of noise may represent not just distraction, but loss. Loss of a perceptual skill refined over millennia. And if meaning once emerged from listening as much as from speaking, what happens when listening fades, replaced by constant signal? What quiet forms of knowing disappear when silence no longer has space to exist? Memory, for the average caveman, did not live in objects. It lived in people. It passed from body to body, shaped by repetition, gesture, and shared experience. There were no archives to consult, no records to correct mistakes. What survived did so because it remained useful, meaningful, or emotionally charged enough to be repeated. Forgetting was not accidental, it was selective. This selectivity shaped culture in quiet ways. Knowledge that no longer fit the environment faded. Techniques unsuited to new climates disappeared. Stories that failed to guide behavior dissolved. What remained was not a complete account of the past, but a functional one. The past existed to serve the present, not to preserve itself. This creates a tension unfamiliar to modern thinking. Today, preservation is often valued for its own sake. In the Paleolithic world, preservation without relevance carried cost. Memory required energy. Repetition took time. Attention was limited. Only what mattered most endured. Yet what mattered was not always practical. Some stories persisted long after their original context vanished. Mythic structures, recurring symbols, and shared motifs appear across distant regions and time periods. Animals that no longer existed continued to appear in art. Patterns outlived conditions. This suggests that memory was not governed solely by utility. Emotion played a role. Stories attached to fear, awe, or belonging embedded themselves deeply. They shaped identity. To belong to a group was to carry its remembered world. Memory created continuity across generations that never met. This continuity complicates the idea that Paleolithic life was ahistorical. While there were no written chronicles, there was a sense of before and after. Certain events became reference points: a great cold, a long drought, a dangerous migration. These events structured collective memory, anchoring stories in time without dates. Ritual reinforced this memory. Reenactment allowed the past to remain present. Painting the same symbols, returning to the same caves, using the same gestures. These acts refreshed memory not as information, but as experience. The past was not studied, it was lived again. Children absorbed this memory without instruction. They learned through participation, through watching elders repeat actions whose origin was never explained, only enacted. Explanation was unnecessary when meaning was embodied. This mode of memory resists modern reconstruction. Archaeology uncovers objects, not repetitions. It captures moments frozen by chance, not processes sustained over generations. The absence of written memory makes Paleolithic culture appear fragmented when it may have been internally coherent. The danger lies in mistaking invisibility for absence. What does not fossilize does not vanish. It simply escapes certain methods of knowing. As human groups expanded and environments shifted, this fragile system of memory faced strain. Larger populations meant less shared experience. Mobility increased contact with strangers. Repetition diluted. Variation multiplied. Memory required new anchors. This pressure may have contributed to the emergence of symbols more detached from immediate experience. Marks that stood in for actions, objects that carried meaning beyond their use. Early counting tokens, repeated motifs, and standardized tools hint at this transition. But during most of the Paleolithic, memory remained relational. To know something was to know someone who knew it. Authority rested in lived experience. Elders mattered not because of age alone, but because they had seen more cycles, survived more change. This made memory vulnerable. When elders died suddenly, knowledge could vanish. When groups fractured, memory fragmented. This vulnerability may explain why some techniques appear, disappear, and reappear across the archaeological record. Loss did not always signal failure. Sometimes it signaled interruption. Climate events likely accelerated this process. Rapid shifts forced movement, separation, and adaptation. Some groups survived by abandoning old knowledge quickly. Others perished by clinging too tightly. Memory in this sense was both asset and risk. Modern narratives often frame early humans as slowly accumulating knowledge toward progress. But accumulation is only one strategy. Pruning is another. The Paleolithic world favored pruning. What no longer worked was allowed to fade without ceremony. This challenges assumptions about loss. What modern observers perceive as disappearance may have been choice. Not conscious erasure, but adaptive forgetting. A willingness to let go. Yet this raises a deeper question. If memory was shaped so strongly by environment and need, then how much of early human thought vanished not because it failed, but because conditions changed? How many ways of understanding the world were abandoned quietly, leaving no trace? If the average caveman lived within a memory system that functioned through presence rather than preservation, then modern attempts to recover that world may always feel incomplete. We search for records where there were only relationships. And if our own world increasingly relies on external memory, stored beyond bodies and communities, what happens when repetition fades and experience is no longer required to remember? What kind of forgetting does that invite, and what might quietly disappear along with it? Conflict existed in the Paleolithic world, but it did not resemble the forms later history would normalize. There were no standing armies, no fortified borders, no written declarations of enmity. Violence, when it occurred, was intimate and costly. Every injury weakened the group. Every death removed knowledge that could not be easily replaced. This reality shaped how conflict was approached, limited, and remembered. Skeletal evidence reveals trauma. but not at scales associated with organized warfare. Injuries suggest skirmishes, ambushes, personal disputes, and accidents more than campaigns. Weapons were multi-purpose tools. A spear used for hunting could wound a human, but it was not designed primarily for that purpose. This dual use blurred the boundary between survival and violence, discouraging escalation. The average caveman lived with the understanding that aggression carried consequences beyond the immediate moment. Retaliation could spiral. Feuds could fracture small groups beyond recovery. Avoidance, negotiation, and ritualized displays likely prevented many conflicts from turning lethal. Distance was an option. Movement allowed tension to dissipate rather than calcify. This does not imply a peaceful ideal. It implies restraint shaped by necessity. When populations are small and interdependent, violence threatens everyone. Survival favors de-escalation, not because of morality, but because of mathematics. There are fewer replacements than losses. Encounters between groups were moments of uncertainty. They could bring opportunity or danger. Exchange, intermarriage, and shared ritual created buffers against violence. Shared symbols may have signaled intent. Body ornamentation, markings, and gestures could communicate affiliation before words were exchanged. Recognition reduced fear. Fear, however, was never absent. Unknown groups carried risk. Resource scarcity increased tension. Climatic stress tested patience. In such moments, conflict may have flared, but its scale remained limited by logistics. There were no supply lines to sustain prolonged fighting, no surplus to support warriors who did not contribute otherwise. Children grew up witnessing these dynamics. They learned that strength alone was insufficient. Coordination mattered. Timing mattered. Knowing when to withdraw mattered. Courage did not mean recklessness. It meant understanding risk and acting within it. Modern narratives often project later patterns backward, imagining early humans as perpetually violent, locked in competition for resources. This projection reflects more about later societies than earlier ones. When land becomes owned, conflict becomes strategic. When surplus accumulates, violence can be sustained. These conditions did not define most of the Paleolithic. The emotional cost of violence also deserves attention. In small groups, there is no anonymity. Harm inflicted is witnessed. Grief is shared. There is no distant battlefield to absorb loss. The psychological weight of killing someone you may have known through shared exchange is not easily dismissed. This intimacy likely shaped ethical instincts long before formal codes. Actions were evaluated through their impact on group cohesion. Behavior that threatened survival was corrected or expelled. Norms emerged organically, enforced through reputation and memory rather than law. The idea of justice in this context was not abstract, it was situational, restorative rather than punitive. Repair mattered more than punishment. A skilled individual could not be easily replaced, even if they caused harm. Solutions balanced accountability with preservation. As populations grew toward the end of the Paleolithic, these systems came under strain. More frequent encounters increased complexity. Memory-based regulation weakened. Anonymous interactions increased. The seeds of larger-scale conflict were planted not through malice, but through density. This shift would accelerate with settlement. Fixed resources intensified competition. Hierarchies emerged. Violence became organized. Distance between decision and consequence widened. But these developments belong to a later chapter. For the average caveman, conflict was a risk to be managed, not an identity to be embraced. Survival depended on cooperation more than domination. This does not romanticize the past, it contextualizes it. The persistence of this cooperative baseline across tens of thousands of years suggests it worked. Humanity did not merely survive, it spread across continents. It adapted to extremes. It did so without institutions designed to enforce order. This raises a quiet question about the origins of violence as we know it. If early humans managed conflict through proximity, memory, and restraint, what changed? Was violence amplified by growth, or was it always waiting, restrained only by circumstance? If the Paleolithic world limited violence not through ideology but through structure, then modern societies may have lost something crucial when those limiting structures dissolved. Distance enables cruelty. Abstraction enables justification. And if the average caveman lived in a world where harm could not be hidden behind systems, what does that suggest about the kinds of violence that become possible when systems grow large enough to obscure responsibility? What the Paleolithic world did not have may be as revealing as what it did. There were no walls dividing inside from outside, no schedules separating work from rest, no written authorities defining truth. The average caveman lived within a reality that resisted separation. Life was continuous. Actions flowed into one another without formal boundaries. This continuity shaped identity. There was no profession in the modern sense. A person hunted, gathered, cared for children, made tools, told stories, and observed the land. Identity was composite, not specialized. Value came from adaptability rather than mastery of a single role. This flexibility buffered groups against loss. If one individual died, others could step into their tasks. Modern societies often equate specialization with advancement, yet specialization introduces dependence. It creates systems that require maintenance. Paleolithic life avoided this trap by remaining broad. Knowledge overlapped. Redundancy was not inefficiency, it was resilience. The absence of ownership altered relationships. Tools were personal but not accumulated. Possessions were limited by mobility. Excess slowed movement. This naturally constrained inequality. Status could not be stored. It had to be performed repeatedly through contribution. Memory, not material, preserved reputation. Time pressure differed as well. Without abstract calendars or deadlines, urgency arose from immediate conditions rather than distant goals. This likely reduced chronic stress. Stress existed, but it was situational, not constant. Anxiety faded when threats passed. The nervous system had time to reset. Sleep patterns reflected this. Without artificial light, sleep followed natural rhythms. Nights were longer, fragmented, shared. Vigilance rotated. Dreams occurred within a social context, discussed, interpreted, woven into understanding of the world. Sleep was not private. It was communal. Privacy itself was rare. Life unfolded in proximity. This constant presence shaped behavior. Actions were visible. Secrecy was difficult. This transparency limited certain behaviors while reinforcing others. Shame and pride operated immediately, not abstractly. This environment shaped emotional regulation. There was little room for prolonged isolation. Grief was shared. Joy was witnessed. Emotions moved through the group rather than stagnating within individuals. While conflict existed, emotional abandonment did not. The average caveman's sense of self likely differed profoundly from modern individuality. Selfhood was relational. One existed through others. This did not erase individuality, but it embedded it. Decisions considered group impact by default. Survival required it. As populations grew and settlement approached, this relational self would strain. Anonymity increased, visibility decreased, roles narrowed, identity detached from daily contribution. These changes reshaped psychology in ways still unfolding. The Paleolithic world also lacked formal accumulation of future-oriented debt. There were no loans, no interest, no obligations extending beyond memory. Reciprocity existed, but it was flexible. Debts were social, not numerical. This reduced long-term tension. The absence of writing meant that agreements remained adaptable. Memory allowed reinterpretation. This could create conflict, but it also allowed adjustment. Written contracts fix relationships. Oral ones evolve. Modern perspectives often view this fluidity as weakness, yet rigidity carries its own risks. Systems that cannot adapt break catastrophically. Paleolithic systems bent continually, avoiding large-scale collapse. This may explain why humanity endured so many environmental shocks before agriculture. Flexibility preserved life. Stability, when it came later, demanded sacrifice. The lack of monuments is telling. Paleolithic humans did not build structures designed to outlast them. Their legacy was carried in people, not stone. This orientation toward the present limited certain achievements but preserved others. Memory lived where it could respond. Modern civilization values permanence. Buildings, texts, records aim to defy time. Yet permanence creates distance. The maker does not see the user. Responsibility diffuses. The average caveman lived without this distance. Consequences were immediate. Feedback was direct. Adaptation was constant. If early human life functioned without many things now considered essential, then those things may not be universally beneficial. They solved certain problems while creating others. This raises an unsettling possibility. The story of progress may obscure trade-offs rather than eliminate them. What was gained in scale and permanence may have been paid for in presence and adaptability. If Paleolithic life fostered resilience through simplicity rather than deprivation, then modern complexity may carry hidden fragility. Fragility masked by abundance, but revealed under stress. And if the average caveman lived within limits that preserved balance, what happens when limits are removed faster than understanding can adapt? What breaks first, the system or the people inside it? The end of the Paleolithic world did not arrive with a single event. It thinned, it fractured, it faded unevenly across regions and generations. For the average caveman, change did not announce itself as an ending. It appeared as small adjustments that accumulated quietly, altering life before anyone could name what was being lost. Climate shifted first. Ice retreated. Forests spread. Rivers changed course. Animals that had been followed for generations moved differently or disappeared. The familiar patterns that once guided movement and memory began to loosen. Knowledge that had worked reliably now required constant revision. Adaptation accelerated. In some places, abundance increased. Wild grains grew densely. Certain animals lingered near human camps. What had once been seasonal opportunities became semi-permanent resources. The logic of movement shifted. Staying began to make sense. This was not a conscious decision to abandon an old way of life. It was a series of responses to immediate conditions. Harvesting grain repeatedly from the same area encouraged return. Returning encouraged clearing. Clearing encouraged staying longer. Slowly, landscapes changed not only in response to climate, but to human presence. With staying came accumulation. Tools no longer needed to be carried constantly. Heavier objects became useful. Storage appeared. Containers multiplied. These changes altered daily rhythms. Work became more repetitive. Time stretched differently when movement slowed. The body felt these changes. Skeletal evidence shows new stress patterns. Knees and backs bore different loads. Diets narrowed. Teeth reveal increased wear from grinding grains. Nutrition shifted. Some deficiencies increased. Life expectancy may have declined in certain regions despite apparent abundance. Social relationships also changed. Proximity extended beyond kin. Larger groups formed around fixed resources. Familiarity diluted. Trust required new mechanisms. Memory alone could not regulate behavior when interactions exceeded lived experience. Norms hardened. This is where the average caveman's world began to dissolve. Not because it failed, but because its scale no longer matched conditions. Systems designed for small, mobile groups strained under density. Flexibility gave way to predictability. Predictability required control. Rituals adapted. Belief systems that once flowed through place and action now attached themselves to sites. Certain locations gained permanence. Sacred spaces fixed meaning rather than renewing it. Authority centralized. Specialists emerged not only in ritual, but in organization. This transition did not happen everywhere at once. For thousands of years, Paleolithic and emerging Neolithic lifeways overlapped. Some groups resisted settlement. Others adopted it temporarily. Movement did not vanish overnight. It receded. What is striking is how quickly later narratives frame this shift as progress. Agriculture becomes inevitable. Settlement becomes destiny. The Paleolithic becomes a prelude, not a viable alternative. This framing simplifies a complex transition shaped by trade-offs rather than triumph. For individuals living through it, the change was not abstract. It altered daily experience, time filled with repetitive labor. Social tension increased. Disease spread more easily in fixed settlements. The environment responded to concentrated use. Yet new possibilities emerged as well. Surplus allowed specialization. Memory moved outside bodies into objects. Symbols grew more complex. Writing would eventually appear. These developments reshaped thought, communication, and power. The cost of these gains was subtle. Knowledge once distributed became concentrated. Decision-making shifted away from consensus toward authority. Violence became organized. Ownership hardened. Boundaries fixed. The average caveman did not disappear. He transformed. His skills adapted or faded. Some forms of knowledge became irrelevant. Others were absorbed and reinterpreted. The past was not erased, but it was reframed. This reframing influences how Paleolithic life is remembered. It becomes something left behind, surpassed, incomplete. Its successes are minimized. Its longevity is rarely emphasized. Few human systems have endured as long or adapted as widely. The silence that surrounds this transition is telling. We have many stories about origins of farming, but few about those who chose not to farm. Few about the grief of leaving mobility behind. Few about the knowledge that no longer fit inside settled life. History favors winners, not survivors. It records systems that leave monuments, not those that leave footprints. The Paleolithic world left few permanent marks by design. Its legacy lived in people, not stone. As modern societies face environmental limits, the memory of this older way of life gains relevance, not as a model to replicate, but as a reminder that alternatives once existed, that humanity thrived without many things now considered indispensable. If the end of the Paleolithic was not a clean break but a slow fading, then some of its wisdom may still linger, unrecognized, embedded in instincts, stories, and discomfort with certain aspects of modern life. And if the average caveman did not vanish, but was reshaped by forces beyond individual choice, what does that suggest about our own position within transitions we barely perceive? What ways of living are thinning now, quietly, as conditions change faster than language can name? Long after the Paleolithic way of life receded, its echoes did not disappear. They settled into the background of human behavior, quiet and persistent, shaping instincts that no longer match the structures forming around them. The average caveman's world dissolved, but the nervous system that evolved within it remained. This mismatch would become one of the most subtle legacies of early human life. Settled existence compressed time. Seasons mattered less than schedules. The land became something to manage rather than listen to. Work separated from rest. Children were no longer immersed in the full rhythm of survival but shielded from it. Learning moved indoors. Knowledge became mediated rather than lived. Yet the body still expected movement. The mind still scanned for patterns. Attention still responded to silence, to open horizons, to firelight. When these cues vanished, something unsettled took their place. Anxiety emerged without immediate cause. Restlessness appeared without direction. Longing detached from object. This is not nostalgia, it is residue. The Paleolithic nervous system was calibrated for intermittent stress, followed by release. Danger arrived, passed, and left space for recovery. In settled life, stress became constant but abstract. Threats were delayed, symbolic, unseen. The body prepared for action that never came. Rituals evolved to compensate. Repetitive actions, shared rhythms, and symbolic narratives attempted to recreate coherence. Festivals echoed seasonal cycles. Music synchronized movement. Prayer and meditation slowed breath. These practices did not originate in civilization. They were adaptations of older patterns, reshaped to fit new constraints. Even storytelling changed. Paleolithic stories were situated, tied to place and action. Later myths became cosmological, moral, explanatory. They filled the gap left by lost intimacy with land. Meaning migrated upward, away from immediate experience. The average caveman had no need to explain existence. Life was self-evident. Meaning emerged from participation. When participation narrowed, explanation expanded. Philosophy, theology, and later science attempted to rebuild orientation through abstraction. This expansion brought power. Those who controlled explanation gained influence. Knowledge moved from shared experience to specialized domains. Access narrowed. Authority hardened. The world became legible through systems rather than senses. Yet resistance persisted. Throughout history, groups returned to older patterns under pressure. Nomadism resurfaced. Ascetic traditions rejected accumulation. Mystical practices sought direct experience over doctrine. These movements were not regressions, they were recalibrations. Archaeological and anthropological evidence shows that even within agricultural societies, Paleolithic habits endured. Foraging supplemented farming. Mobility persisted at margins. Communal decision-making survived in pockets. These remnants suggest that the older way of life never fully vanished. It adapted, hid, and resurfaced. Modern fascination with rewilding, minimalism, and ancestral health reflects this unfinished transition. These movements are often framed as trends, but they point to deeper discomfort. The body remembers a different rhythm. The mind senses missing context. Technology accelerates this tension. As mediation increases, direct experience decreases. Memory externalizes further. Attention fragments. The skills that once sustained humanity for tens of thousands of years become niche hobbies or therapeutic practices. This does not mean that Paleolithic life was superior. It was constrained, vulnerable, and demanding. But it was aligned. Its costs and rewards were immediate. Feedback was constant. Adjustment was possible. Modern life offers unprecedented safety and reach, but at the cost of coherence. Systems grow too large for individuals to feel their influence. Consequences unfold slowly and distantly. Responsibility diffuses. The average caveman lived in a world where actions mattered visibly. Today, actions often vanish into systems. This invisibility alters ethics. It weakens accountability. It strains meaning. History rarely frames the Paleolithic as a lost equilibrium. It presents it as a beginning to be escaped. But this framing may obscure a different truth. The Paleolithic was not a rough draft. It was a long, stable chapter that ended not because it failed, but because conditions changed. Understanding this does not require abandoning modern life. It requires recognizing trade-offs. It requires humility about what was lost as well as what was gained. The deepest loss may not have been tools or techniques, but orientation, a way of being that integrated body, environment, and community without mediation. A way of knowing when enough was enough. If such orientation once guided humanity through extreme change, its absence now may explain certain modern crises. Environmental degradation, social fragmentation, and psychological strain reflect systems operating beyond the scale they evolved to manage. The Paleolithic world reminds us that survival does not require domination, and meaning does not require permanence. It suggests that attention, restraint, and relationship can sustain life longer than accumulation. If these lessons linger faintly within us, ignored but not erased, then the question is not whether we can return to an ancient way of life. It is whether we can remember enough of it to recalibrate our own. And if the average caveman lived within limits that preserved balance for tens of thousands of years, What does it say about a civilization that forgets limits faster than it forgets its origins? The story of the average caveman ends, in most tellings, long before it reaches the present. It is folded neatly into prehistory, sealed off behind glass cases and timelines, treated as a solved problem. And yet, certain questions refuse to rest. Not because answers are missing, but because the way the questions are framed may already limit what can be seen. What if Paleolithic life is not merely something humanity passed through, but something humanity is still negotiating with? The persistence of certain human behaviors suggests unfinished business. The pull toward open spaces. The calming effect of firelight. The instinct to walk without destination. The ease with which silence restores attention. These are not cultural accidents. They are responses shaped over immense spans of time, refined long before writing, agriculture, or states. Modern neuroscience quietly confirms this. The human brain did not evolve for static environments. It evolved for movement, novelty, and direct feedback. Dopamine systems respond not to possession, but to pursuit. Stress systems activate in response to uncertainty, not abundance. The body still expects a world that moves, changes, and answers back. Yet the modern world often withholds that response. Action no longer produces visible consequence. Effort disappears into abstraction. The land does not answer directly. Food arrives without season. Danger becomes symbolic. This dissonance accumulates slowly, felt as unease rather than crisis. The average caveman lived inside consequence. If a decision failed, the effect was immediate. If cooperation broke down, survival faltered. This immediacy sharpened judgment. It discouraged excess. It rewarded attentiveness. In contrast, modern systems buffer consequence. Failure can be deferred, harm can be displaced, responsibility can be diluted. This does not make humans more capable. It makes feedback quieter, and when feedback fades, adjustment slows. The Paleolithic world enforced limits without ideology. Resources were finite, energy was visible, time was embodied. There was no need to argue for restraint. Restraint was the default condition of survival. This enforced humility shaped belief. Humans did not imagine themselves as separate from the world. They negotiated with it. Animals were not symbols of domination, but of power that demanded respect. Weather was not an inconvenience, but an authority. As civilizations grew, this relationship inverted. Humans increasingly imagined control. The land became resource. Animals became property. Time became commodity. The old humility fractured, replaced by confidence that systems could substitute for attention. That confidence has been tested repeatedly. Each collapse in history carries echoes of a deeper imbalance, systems growing beyond the scale of human perception and care. When coordination outpaces comprehension, fragility increases. The Paleolithic world avoided this trap not through wisdom alone, but through structure. Small groups, shared experience, immediate feedback. These constraints prevented runaway complexity. Modern societies have removed many of these constraints without replacing their function. Technology accelerates scale, but does not restore intimacy. Communication expands reach, but not accountability. Knowledge multiplies, but fragments. In this context, the figure of the caveman returns not as ancestor, but as mirror. Not a primitive to be surpassed, but a reminder of alignment between organism and environment. This does not mean that early humans lived in harmony in some idealized sense. It means they lived within limits that shaped behavior automatically, limits that modern life must now recreate consciously, if at all. Some contemporary movements gesture toward this recognition. Slow living, ecological design, community-based decision-making, embodied practices. These are often dismissed as nostalgia or luxury, but they may represent attempts to restore feedback loops broken by scale. History rarely asks whether progress requires forgetting, but forgetting may be its hidden cost. Each new system solves old problems while obscuring old solutions. The Paleolithic world solved coordination at small scales remarkably well. It failed at large ones. Civilization solved scale, but struggles with coherence. The average caveman did not need to define meaning. Meaning emerged from participation. Modern humans often seek meaning precisely because participation has thinned. Explanation replaces experience. This shift shapes not only psychology but ethics. When actions are detached from outcome, moral reasoning abstracts. Responsibility becomes theoretical. Guilt diffuses. The Paleolithic world anchored ethics in visibility. Harm was seen. Care was witnessed. Memory preserved reputation. There was no hiding behind systems. If modern societies wish to address their deepest crises, technological solutions alone may be insufficient. Recalibration may require reintroducing forms of visibility, limitation, and shared consequence. Not as regression, but as integration. The caveman, then, is not a ghost from a vanished world. He is a pressure within the present, reminding humanity of an older equilibrium that cannot be fully discarded without cost. As the pace of change accelerates, the distance between human biology and human systems widens. This gap generates stress, fragmentation, and ecological overshoot. The Paleolithic story offers no blueprint, but it offers perspective. It suggests that humanity once lived for tens of thousands of years without collapsing the systems it depended on. That alone demands attention. If such endurance was possible without hierarchy, writing, or surplus, then modern claims of inevitability deserve scrutiny. Progress may not be linear. Advancement may require remembering as much as inventing. And if the average caveman's life still shapes the limits of human attention, patience, and care, then the question becomes less about how far we have come and more about how far we can go without losing alignment altogether. What happens when a species outgrows the conditions it evolved to survive in, yet forgets the knowledge embedded in those conditions before learning how to replace it? There is no single moment when the life of the average caveman truly ends. No final fire extinguished. No last footprint erased. Instead, the Paleolithic world dissolves into layers beneath the present, quieter with each passing age, yet never fully gone. Its absence is not a void but a pressure, felt most strongly when modern systems strain, when certainty fractures, when progress no longer feels synonymous with improvement. What remains most elusive is not how early humans survived, but how they understood being alive without needing to define it. Their lives did not revolve around explanation. They revolved around participation. Meaning was not extracted from experience. It was inseparable from it. Hunger, movement, cooperation, danger, rest. These were not problems to solve permanently, but conditions to navigate repeatedly. This orientation produced a kind of humility rarely named in historical narratives. Humans did not stand above the world, nor beneath it. They stood within it. The land was neither enemy nor possession. It was context. Animals were neither symbols nor resources alone. They were neighbors in a shared system of risk and dependence. As modern societies confront environmental limits, psychological fragmentation, and accelerating complexity, the Paleolithic world reappears not as an answer, but as a contrast sharp enough to reveal what has drifted. It reminds us that long-term survival once depended less on control than on responsiveness, less on accumulation than on balance. The silence surrounding early human inner life becomes meaningful here. Perhaps it is not silence at all, but incompatibility. Their way of knowing does not translate easily into records because it did not separate knowledge from living. To write it down would have been to misunderstand it. Modern attempts to reconstruct Paleolithic life often search for missing sophistication or hidden technology. But the sophistication may lie elsewhere, in restraint, in attentiveness, in systems that limited scale rather than expanded it. These are not qualities that leave monuments. The average caveman did not design civilization. Civilization emerged from countless adaptations layered over time, but those adaptations were not value neutral. Each solved certain problems while introducing others. The Paleolithic world solved coordination at the scale of human perception. Civilization solved coordination beyond it. Now, humanity lives with the consequences of that expansion. Systems grow faster than ethics. Technology outpaces reflection. Distance separates action from outcome. The feedback that once shaped behavior becomes delayed or invisible. In this environment, the Paleolithic legacy becomes a kind of quiet critique. It asks whether all growth is improvement, whether efficiency always serves well-being, whether meaning can survive when participation thins. The caveman's life was not easy. It was exposed, vulnerable, and constrained, but it was coherent. Body, mind, community, and environment aligned closely enough that survival reinforced understanding. That coherence is difficult to recreate once lost, yet fragments persist. In moments of deep focus outdoors, in shared labor that dissolves self-consciousness, in rituals that slow time, in music that synchronizes breath and movement. These moments feel grounding because they resonate with older patterns, even if unrecognized. History often treats the Paleolithic as a ladder rung left behind, but ladders imply upward direction. Human development may be better understood as branching, with paths taken and paths abandoned. Some branches extend far but grow fragile. Others remain short but sturdy. The danger lies in mistaking endurance for inferiority. The Paleolithic way of life endured longer than any civilization that followed. Its disappearance was not due to collapse, but to transformation. That distinction matters. If humanity faces another transformation, driven by climate, technology, or scale, the lessons embedded in early human life may regain relevance, not as nostalgia but as orientation, not as blueprint but as reminder. The average caveman does not answer modern questions. He reframes them. He shifts focus from what humans can build to what humans can sustain, from speed to balance, from dominance to fit. In the end, the mystery is not whether Paleolithic humans were intelligent, complex, or meaningful. The evidence suggests they were. The deeper mystery is why modern narratives insist on their simplicity, even when confronted with their endurance. Perhaps simplifying the past makes the present feel justified. Perhaps forgetting older equilibria allows newer imbalances to seem inevitable. If so, then the real loss may not be Paleolithic knowledge itself, but the habit of questioning whether the direction of history is synonymous with wisdom. As this long human story continues, the caveman remains, not behind us, but beneath us. A foundation rarely acknowledged, yet constantly tested. A reminder that survival once depended not on escaping nature, but on listening to it closely. And if listening was once humanity's most reliable skill, the one that carried it through ice, drought, and uncertainty, then the final question lingers quietly without urgency or demand. What happens when a species that learned to survive by listening forgets how to hear itself inside the world it has built?